welcome everyone. I'm deeply honored to stand here today to introduce the 2024 Claude Acke Memorial Lecture. And over the past few months, I had the privilege of getting to know Professor Tembo, and I can think of no more fitting recipient of this position. During his time in Uppsala, he has demonstrated academic excellence, not only in his own work, but also in his generous comments and feedback that he has provided to others. And his unwavering dedication to social justice is evident in every discussion we have had. I'm particularly grateful for how Professor Tembo's work illuminates the interconnectedness of humanity. When we first discussed the topic of today's lecture, a severe hurricane was approaching Florida. This sparked a conversation about how victims of the escalating climate crisis, regardless of where they are, often share similar psychological consequences. At the same time, its research underscored the deep inequities of our world and the urgent need for climate justice. Malawi, despite having some of the lowest carbon emissions globally, bears some of the harshest consequences of climate change. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nick Tembo as he delivers this year's Claude Acke Memorial Lecture. And of course, I forgot. Marie said, like, don't forget this, but I did that anyway. We are sending this on Zoom and we are taking pictures. So everyone is aware of that and that you need to protest if it's not okay for you to, that we do that. Sorry, Nick, and sorry for forgetting.
It's okay. Okay, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I'm going to make a presentation in the aftermath of a national tragedy, excavating memories of Cyclone Freddy in Malawi. It's mostly personal reflections, but as is typical of academics, I'll begin with an introduction and background where I try to set the context before I tell you my story. So allow me to share my story with you for the next 40 or so minutes. When Malawi's Department of Climate Change and Meteorological Services issued a warning on 4 March 2023 that the country's densely populated southern parts were going to be hit by severe tropical cyclone Freddy, most people thought that the havoc the storm was going to leave in its wake would not be that intense and devastating. They were probably thinking that way because they had experienced similar tropical storms before. The storm finally hit Malawi on Sunday, 12 March 2023, having previously wreaked havoc in Mozambique, Madagascar, Mauritius, and Zimbabwe. Within 6 days of landing in Malawi, the malevolent storm dumped the equivalent of 6 months' rain, thereby making it the most destructive storm, recorded in history. The speed with which the storm moved on human lives was also unprecedented. Most of its victims vanished into the angry waters in the blink of an eye, without a trace. For those whose lifeless bodies were able to be recovered, the pain of burying the dead was even more unbearable, considering that these were people that had been bubbling with health just hours before the storm had struck. I bring up these anecdotal accounts because they speak to the central concerns of this study, and that is exploring the lasting impacts of Cyclone Freddy on individual and communal lives in Southern Africa, using Malawi as its analytic lens. The question I wanted to find an answer to, and which stimulated this investigation, was, can personal and collective experiences of loss and grief be part of national mourning? I envisage Cyclone Freddy as part of a continually evolving set of systemic vulnerabilities in ongoing dealings with humanity. This explains why I also examine cyclones as revenants that keep Malawian communities at their wits' end. I locate my study within the trauma and memory discourse to examine both the role of witnessing to the difficulties in using experiential narratives as a form of inquiry to connect to actual or witnessed threat to life and safety. I consider these difficulties as part of what I call excavating memories, used here not strictly in the mode of archaeological excavations that use test pits, trenches, and stratigraphy in order to interpret a layered history of how people in the past referenced and even more distant past, but rather as a narrative sleight of hand to metaphorically unearth those recurring memories of mourning, loss, and longing post-Cyclone Freddy. In a sense, what I do is akin to engaging in archaeological ways of thinking about the memory and spectrality of Cyclone Freddy in Malawi. Excavating memory, in this sense, becomes an attempt at making present those stories of the past that have been concealed or silenced, and responding to them in politically and ethically accountable ways. In terms of theoretical and conceptual underpinnings, my study lies in the broad association of natural disasters with ontology within the Cyclone Freddy discourse, highlighting how people that were once affected by past cyclones feel each time they hear of a hurricane gathering in the horizon. In my view, there is a revenant for the communities are affected by Cyclone Freddy, and all that comes within the storm's reach is rendered ontological. This is where I find Derrida's notion of ontology useful, since it aids me to understand how past occurrences implicate the present and shape the future. Derrida used this term to describe a condition where the past infiltrates and influences the present in ways that are not fully recognized or acknowledged, thereby creating a sense of haunting. Ontology is thus taken as a shorthand for the ways in which the past returns to haunt the present. In this explication, the crucial element is that of the petition comparison, or the return of the past in the present, which is manifested through the figure of the revenant, that which returns each time as if it were the first, unchanging and insistent, demanding a reckoning for a message that went unheard or ignored. Ontology is, in this sense, a helpful critical tool to view the numerous instances of foreshadowing and reenactment of past traumas that can be traced in Cyclone Freddy survivors. I also work with the concept of impossible mourning to explore how the lingering, ghostly presence of the past not only haunts and shapes the present, but also creates ways that present closure or finality. Understood by Derrida as that type of mourning that is interminable, irreconcilable, and inconsolable, impossible morning entails a gap, a hole, a void, an opening that metaphorically remains unclosed, which, as Derrida stresses, remains at work endlessly, hollowing out the depths of our memory right up until death. What we are dealing with in Impossible Morning, therefore, is the endlessness of unresolved pain. I argue that Cyclone Freddy has a resonance of Impossible Morning. In the Malawian context, this impossibility has a traumatic history behind it, and it is based on the repeated occurrence of Napolo, a term used in Malawian mythology to refer to a powerful subterranean serpent or spirit-like being believed to be responsible for natural disasters, particularly heavy rains, landslides, cyclones, hurricanes, earthquakes, flash floods, or severe floods. Indeed, Cyclone Freddy was only one of the many other disasters that have happened in this small southeastern African country in recent time. The first Napolo, according to various sources, occurred on 13th December 1946, when a severe cyclone deflected from the Indian Ocean and was followed by heavy rains that continuously poured in the southern parts of Malawi for over 40 hours. Since that event, the word Napolo is used in Malawian local grammar to explain any tragic event caused by kinesthetic forces of nature triggered by human activities. And since then, Malawi has had over 15 natural disasters, with 13 of them known to have descended on the country in the past 5 years alone. This data excludes numerous other climate change-related hazards, such as heat waves, floods, drought, wildfires, food insecurity, that have also affected the country. The local construction of Napolo as an enduring metaphor for natural disasters allows me to adopt the term as an interpretive paradigm for exploring the urgency and urgency of climate change discourse in Malawi. Given that the locals are aware that the destruction of the environment angers Napolo, according to local law, who may then descend on them through landslides, mudslides, and floods, what is their level of preparedness towards mitigating national disaster? What are the possible dilemmas and contradictions in embracing Napolo as an environmental preservation tool to reinforce society's collective values and beliefs about the environment on the one hand, and on the other, the people's wanton destruction of the same environment they are supposed to preserve? Who shifts the parameters of environmental conservation in Malawi, and why? Part of this study addresses these questions, stressing the role of both the local populations and the state in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction initiative. This brings me to the question of temporality and cyclicality of disasters. As already indicated, Malawi is a perennial candidate of natural disasters. This recurrent overlap in disasters has complicated response and recovery efforts and has, as a consequence, created that enduring impossibility to fully process the loss or damage and suffering the disasters leave in their wake. A kind of impossibility that leads to a suspension of closure, a refusal of easy resolution to an overwhelming event that has just happened to one. Using Napolo as an interpretive framework, thus enables me to establish the enduring despair, dejection, misery, and melancholy that these people have suffered over time. A kind of uncertainty that is brought to bear on them because the disasters keep coming and going, like the mythical Abiku in West African folklore, causing untold human misery and loss and disrupting traditional grieving modes essential for individual and communal healing. For me, this is impossible mourning writ large. It also brings me briefly to the question of tragedy. While I acknowledge that the word has multiple meanings and interpretations depending on context, my use of the term is restricted to a mode of expression that is used to mediate what Tere Egerton understands to be cataclysm and disaster involving loss of life. Kathleen Sands thinks that tragedy is the telling of suffering, which is what I'm going to tell today, which would signify focusing on suffering that, according to Bright Moland, valorizes and dignifies violence, catastrophe, agony, and bereavement. The term national tragedy, as used in my title, signifies the ways in which the depth of human suffering gripped the entire nation when Cyclone Freddy descended on Malawi, to the extent that the state president declared 14 days of national mourning. In declaring 14 days of national mourning, the state was not only acknowledging the catastrophe, but also recognizing the need for everyone to take a moment of reflection and literally grieve with those that had experienced loss. By doing so, the state was participating in an act of working through trauma, understood by Kate Skick as a process of mourning in which individuals and communities mourn past and present suffering. It is a political work of mourning that leads actors to consider how things might be different and to take the risk of acting to challenge the status quo. This explains why I bring up the notion of collective mourning later in this discussion to summon that sense of shared experience of pain and the tragic, and how a process of working through is enacted in post-Cyclone Freddy Malawi. My aim here is to show how a loss that is felt at individual level often imbricates and implicates everyone in the community. In that sense, the personal or individual becomes collective. One further comment is worth making in respect to the two concepts discussed above. Both ontology and impossible mourning entail contours of the uncanny, which I think needs to be emphasized in the context of the post-Cyclone Freddy Malawian psychosociality project, which is being proposed here. What is apparent in both concepts and what a psychoanalytic approach would seek to emphasize is that loss, absence, and persistence of the past are not of an isolated intrapsychic sort, but occur instead within the social field via communal analysis and interpretation for an account of threats to communal peace and what communities ought to do to mitigate dangers brought on by disaster. I'll briefly talk about the methods and approaches that are used in this study, So I draw on the breadth of perspective I matured as someone that experienced secondary traumatization from the impact of Cyclone Freddy on vulnerable communities in Malawi, choosing an approach where I present myself as not only empathizing with my compatriots as they grapple with the enduring physical and emotional scars left by the tropical storm, but also being literally traumatized by the horrific deaths that occurred. Such an approach of writing the self into the other necessitates that I use narrative autoethnography as my interpretive framework to show how my story not only resonates with that of my immediate and distant community members, but also how I am more empathic towards those that were affected by Cyclone Freddy. This is consistent with what Christopher Paulos also says, that ethnography as an approach to research attempts to recenter the researcher's experience as vital in and to the research process. Specifically talking about this study, data for the autoethnography research were collected through anecdotal insights, informal conversations, social narratives, rough notes, and random online witness accounts. The premise for this data collection method is that every Malawian was directly or indirectly affected, that therefore the personal can easily feed into the collective and vice versa. More importantly, I used this interpretive approach to assess the potential traumatic impact of Cyclone Freddy on those that were and probably still are affected by it. Specifically, this study focuses on 3 personal reflections and 4 purposefully selected online accounts. In total then, 7 case studies were selected for analysis. In purposive sampling, samples are carefully chosen on the basis of some precise criteria that are deemed to be crucial. In the case of my study, the precise criteria involved targeting 2 women who had lost their children and 2 others who had lost their property to Cyclone Freddy. All the online witness accounts were covered by either international agencies or news outlets and can easily be accessed and verified online. Now, let me turn to what I call mournings, anxieties, and loss. I'll begin with personal reflections, and then I'm going to focus on what I call collective mourning. So during Cyclone Freddy, I experienced 3 forms of spectral haunting. I will focus on 2 here to illustrate my point, but also in the interest of time. The first of these traumatic moments was the loss of 17 extended family relations that were swept away by the turbulent waters in the Malawi-Mozambique border district of Mulanje. These are people we have never heard from since then, and are among the 537 people that have officially been reported missing. The visual memories we had on the morning of 14 March 2023, when we received news that an entire village in Nanchidwa, Mulanje, had been swept away by the angry floods, were those of our loved ones hysterically kicking against the surging waves. These images created the onset of anxiety and frantic phone calls in all of us as we hoped against hope that nothing bad had happened to them. The hope we were nursing here is an example of mourning. A scenario where instead of just grieving and coming to terms with our loss, we were still longing for the lost object, still refusing to abandon the hope that this lost object will return to us. The idea of still longing for the lost object echoes the notion of impossible mourning, although in my case, there was a semblance of finding closure to the loss through a memorial service we held in remembrance of the missing 17. In holding the memorial service, we were performing a restorative action, an act that Pauline Boss finds important since, according to her, only when things are made right again, bodies produced, services held, and grieving validated by the larger community, can people put their losses to rest. For us, however, holding the memorial had nothing to do with coming to terms with unclear goodbyes or the loss without closure, more than putting our loss to rest. We were honoring and memorializing our relations even as we were remembering to forget them. Because as I said, these people have not been found up to now. The second incident involved a casual conversation I had with a friend with whom I co-own a farm along the Lake Chirwa semi-arid basin. Now, Lake Chirwa is the second largest lake in Malawi. 10 months after our farmhouse was washed away on 12 January 2024, my business associate suggested that it was time we seriously considered selling all the livestock and abandoning the idea of keeping the farm altogether. My colleague was of the opinion that, since the said farm is located along the Lake Chirwa Basin, there was a high likelihood that sooner than later, the lake was going to reclaim the surrounding dry land, including our farm. We should not delude ourselves that our farm won't be struck by another monster storm in the near future, he said. For him, the farm and its surrounding area had assumed a spectral haunting to be brought on by the likely return of another Napolo or another disaster. His suggestion that we should close business, therefore, recalls the workings of the spectre, which, according to scholars, is predicated upon the return, the act of coming back, that questions the temporal boundaries of that which has happened and that which is yet to come. It is this repetition compulsion or act of coming back that must have prompted my colleague to question our sanity in continuing with the rebuilding of the farm and to suggest instead that we take preemptive measures to save ourselves from any future heartbreaks. 10 months after my colleague suggested we abandon the livestock farming project, we still remotely operate the farm. But the dynamics have completely changed. We no longer carry that enthusiasm we first had when we started the project. In fact, we last visited the farm before the onset of the 2022-2023 rainy season. And these days, we almost always skate around the subject about when next we are going to visit the farm. Often, one of us would suggest it is time we went to the farm to see how things are, but none encourages the other to actually make that final push to leave for the farm. For close to a century, the concept of avoidance has been central in psychology and psychiatry, primarily focusing on it as a coping mechanism where an individual evades dealing with stressful emotions, thoughts, situations, or even responsibilities. Psychologists see avoidance as a common response to anxiety, stress, and fear. And while it can provide short-term relief, it often reinforces negative feelings and patterns over time. From a psychiatric point of view, the problem with avoidance is that it can lead to various forms of disorders, including ADs and PTSD. I see a similar dynamic at play in our situation here, where we find comfort in using a third party to give us updates about the goings on at the farm, when we know that overcoming avoidance is the first step on the road to getting our lives back. Let me talk about collective mourning. I'm going to focus on 4 case studies, as I said. So in this section, I focus on 4 heart-rending accounts of women who experienced loss in their families. The first incident involves a story of Jacqueline Dixon, a mother of 2, who narrowly escaped death from Cyclone Freddy. She narrates, "I was making sima. I noticed one of the walls was soaking wet with water leading onto the bucket where I stored the maize flour. Sensing imminent danger, I scooped up my sleeping baby and rushed out. Just after I got out, the wall collapsed onto the bucket, shattering it. We couldn't salvage anything from the house." As Dixon's story shows, her home was hit by the storm as she barely had time to salvage anything from the house. The fact that Storm Freddy came when she was preparing a meal for her small family also shows that after the storm had struck, her family must have gone hungry. Considering that she had small children, aged 5 and 2 and 1 respectively, we can further surmise that she must have found living so hard after scurrying to safety. Of course, the online story does not give further details as to how she must have felt afterwards, considering that her house was partially destroyed. However, it is not hard to speculate that she must have felt disaffected. The reporter, it seems to me, intervenes in Dixon's plight in 2 fundamental ways. One having to do with the path to recovery and rehabilitation, the other with the role and function of witnessing to a national tragedy. In regard to the first, the reporter understands the importance of restoration as a means of remembering and transmitting national memory. The organization on whose behalf he writes the story, UNICEF Malawi, is here presented as an important stakeholder in ensuring that the affected populations are provided with immediate humanitarian needs as a first step. UNICEF Malawi's commitment to assist the government of Malawi has led them to be counted as one of the leading aid agencies in protecting the vulnerable populations. This brings me to the second point. Looking at the story as a retainer of social memory engages the damage wrought by Cyclone Freddy without necessarily being a symptom of that damage. That is to say, the story enters into dialogue with a history of impossible mourning in Malawi without itself being a reminder of that impossibility. The reporter's story is a carefully woven piece that creates a critical distance for facilitating recovery efforts and enabling affected populations, as opposed to reminding them about the loss they experienced. And witnessing is transferable. The reporter, like the witnessing act or the organization on whose behalf he is reporting, can make witnesses of others. He is here informing fellow journalists, philanthropists, policymakers, and others about what UNICEF Malawi is doing on the ground so that they too can follow suit. He is both witnessing to an event and sharing real-time experiences of restorative acts. In the process, he participates in a collective understanding of societal plight and collective memory. The next story is probably more traumatizing in relation to all the 7 case studies covered in this study. It tells the story of 21-year-old Mary Edward, who recounts how she lost her baby to the raging waters of the Ruo River while up in a tree as she waited for help. This is what she says. I had to climb a tree to save my baby and myself. For 2 days, I was stuck up in there, clinging to a branch. I saw branches of trees falling into the water with the people. Then, when I wanted to suckle my 3-month-old baby, it suddenly slipped out of my hands. I am tormented. I am mourning my baby. A poignant memory is evocated in Edward's sad story. A 3-month-old baby slipping from the mother's hands when she was trying to nourish it. Such a haunting memory offers a recounting of Cyclone Freddy as a killer storm that sent close to 1,500 people to their early graves in its 38-day lifespan. The picture of Mary Edward stuck up in a tree for 2 days as she was waiting for help conjures up an image that seems to portray how hard it must have been for a young mother to tenaciously hold onto her child on an empty stomach while literally waiting for Godot. The image of a hungry mother trying to nourish her baby possesses resilient urgency, by which I mean to say that the mother shows ultimate maternal sacrifice to put her well-being and health on the line for the sake of her child. Such a delicate balance, as she clung to a tree branch, epitomizes priceless love. A further element of resilient urgency at hand is worth emphasizing here. Stories of mothers and sometimes fathers making existential sacrifices are not uncommon in Malawi's history of unending disasters and hazards. Hence, to invoke resilient urgency is also to invoke the broader communal anxieties about the future and survival of the next generation in the face of a present calamity. What is so vital about this element of self-sacrificial urgency is that it makes Edward's awful subjective position communicable. It turns it into something that others can relate to. This role is enabling intersubjectivity. Whereas the mother's grief is recognized, validated, and supported both by others and within herself through empathy, shared meaning, cultural practices, and communication. There is, in other words, a collective dimension to the mother's grief, which brings with it an intersubjective proviso through which she can find comfort, connection, and a sense of belonging as she navigates her pain. It is very interesting to note that the reporter in this story gives narrative power to 21-year-old Edward, who is presented as offering a candid narration of her ordeal, hanging on to hope, even when that hope was slowly slipping away from her. What we see in Edward's story, therefore, is the audacity of hope in the face of an impending doom. It is a tale of mourning and melancholia in which Edward is able to narrate how she clung to life after she had just lost another. This ensures that Edward's narrative offers a sincere depiction of the existential ennui that confronted both victim and survivor. What is important in the narrative that Edward presents here is that it resonates with many other survival accounts who were and still could be suffering from a central feature of impossible mourning. That anguishing attempt to reconstruct a world of meaning that has been shattered by loss. It is possible that most Malawians are still grappling with the loss of their loved ones, of the things they once held dear, of their property. In another story carried out by Action Aid, the non-governmental organization reports how a 43-year-old woman named Annie is worried about her future after losing her possession to Cyclone Freddy. She moves into one of the old abandoned houses from where she recounts, "I'm worried about my future and the future of my friends. We are not sure of the future with what has happened to us. Our future is in disarray. We are confused and we don't know where to start from or where things are going. Our friends and relatives are gone. They are gone. It is dark all around us. We don't know what to do." Annie is here expressing her anxiety about the future, which appears bleak for her. The past brings anxious moments while the present looks broken and desolate. The future, on the other hand, looks impossible to attain. What Annie is saying recalls scholarship on ontology, in which the traumatized subject compares the present unfavorably with the future because of something troubling from the past. For Annie, therefore, the future is in disarray precisely because the present moment has lost its meaning with her friends and relatives gone. Annie's story is thus a wake of mourning as she still longs for her lost friends and relations, still refusing to let go of what used to be. In yet another story in the same report, Action Aid presents 20-year-old Asia as losing her 4 children to Storm Freddy. The lady in question had sent her children to go and stay with her grandmother because she thought the older woman's house was sturdier than her own. But as fate would have it, they did not survive at the grandmother's place. We haven't been able to recover the bodies of the children. We have even gone as far as Mozambique to look for them, but we have not found them. Like Annie's story, Asia's story is a story of mourning. In the aftermath of these floods, Asia recounts how frightening rain can be and the lasting impact of the trauma of the events of the night of the flood. We are scared of the rains. We get scared every time it starts raining. And we wonder, is it not enough? Hasn't it taken enough lives already? Does it want to kill us all? Asia's past encounter with Freddy is here presented as not only leaving her in a state of shock, but also in a state of existential angst. Here, we see the absurdity of not being certain about the onset of the rainy season. Generally, people hunger for certainty. Even sure knowledge of death is more welcome to people than a continuation of doubt. This certainty is not granted to Asia here, as her community as her community members who get scared every time it starts raining, wondering if the rains are not going to kill us all the way they did her 4 children. For us here then, Cyclone Freddy may have gone, but the onset of each rainy season seems to have assumed an avatar of uneasiness, death, and destruction. Consequently, she no longer conceives a present that is without danger. Perceiving the present with uncertainty, as Asia and her immediate community members do here, can make people feel helpless and thus more prone to depression, anxiety, stress, and emotional exhaustion. This is also what Kangoma and Bwanali say in their study, that apart from depression, other mental health conditions that may be precipitated or perpetuated by the tropical cyclone include acute stress disorder, anxiety, depression, adjustment disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and sleep disorders. Illustrating their thesis further, the two scholars note that victims of the tropical storm have uncontrollable stress, substance dependency, feelings of grief, and sadness for a prolonged period of time, and adjustment problems which affect the proper functioning of the individual as well as the community, resulting in family conflicts. Let me conclude by saying it is thus only fair for me to reiterate what Clifford Robson once said in his analysis of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's A Grain of Wheat. The wounds people suffer from often do not heal or only heal superficially, to be opened at a later date by a chance moment or event. While Robson's words are in relation to the trauma surrounding the Kenyan independence experience, where as readers we are made firmly aware of how the experiences of those who suffered live with them, intruding into their daily lives, his observations remain compelling in a much broader sense, in that they seem to resonate quite profoundly with a good number of the lives memorialized in my study. Lives who are still trying to come to terms with the after effects of Cyclone Freddy. Their inability to forget what the malevolent storm did to them. In all the witness accounts covered in this study, therefore, the challenge regarding Cyclone Freddy is the question of people's psychological well-being. As I have consistently argued in this study, this is the work of ontology and impossible mourning. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for great lecture. It should really, the testimonies that you share, they should really be mandatory listening for all the world leaders and others that are gathered at the COP29 in Baku at the moment, because they are so powerful and really show, so extremely powerful stories of the climate crisis. And in my eagerness to leave the floor to you, I not only forgot to say that we were recording, I also forgot to introduce myself. And even more important, I forgot to introduce Angela. So I'm Johan Bruché, Associate Professor at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research. And I will soon leave the floor to Angela Mavumba-Sellström, who together with Nick Tembo will have a discussion about this presentation. And after that, we will get some closing word from Eleanor Fisher, who is the head of research at the Nordic Africa Institute, and Angela is senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. And after that, there is also a reception that you're all invited to. But for now, I give the floor to you two to have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Johan, and thank you very much, Nick, for a very powerful and provoking Claude Ake lecture. My task is to try to kind of relate to the research that Nick has prepared and presented, as well as to try to generate a bit of a discussion between the two of us before we open up for the larger discussion with the audience. And in preparing, I thought I am not a disaster specialist. Nor am I a psychologist or an expert on trauma. My background is in peace and security, and I'm also affiliated to Uppsala University's Department for Peace and Conflict Research. So I'm really interested in the affinity between this research and what we know about individuals and societies overcoming other kinds of collective trauma. So trauma that's brought on by genocide or mass atrocity. And so in that case, in that way, I'm coming to this a bit of a novice and kind of naively to this research. And I, when this study on Cyclone Freddy and what happened in Malawi is very interesting in the context of what Johan referred to, the rising levels of disaster and crisis facing people. And the WHO has estimated that, I think in 2022, over 110 million people were affected by disasters in Africa, and that this accounted for almost 60% of the total of the populations globally. So Africa has become really a center for this sort of these sorts of disasters in terms of affecting people's everyday lives. And what's interesting to me is that the report that the WHO wrote that I looked at said that actually that this number had increased almost astonishingly from about 9% in 2002 all the way to 60% in 2022. So it's a very big shift that societies have to kind of contend with on the continent. Then the other aspect I wanted to talk about was trauma, which I'm not 100% clear on. I think that this paper gives so much richness in terms of understanding or thinking more clearly about different types of trauma. The peace building literature has delved into this, and there are scholars here in Uppsala, Karin Brunius, for example, at Uppsala University, who've done really interesting work about truth-telling, for example, which is related to healing and recovery from trauma. But the peace-building literature kind of falls along the lines of thinking about it as a kind of fallout or an encounter that is so horrifying that it throws those who experience it into a world of fear, chaos, and uncertainty. And I think it's really interesting when we think about disaster and people affected by natural disasters that are not addressed and prevented by or managed and mitigated by authorities and governments, that trauma can also be experienced as a kind of moral injury, and it can refer to a feeling of being betrayed by persons in authority. And I think that's relevant to this work that you have done, Nick. It also can undermine personal efficacy. And relational capacity, how people relate to one another, and their ability to integrate the upheavals of life in meaningful ways. And I think the personal narratives here are really relevant in terms of thinking about that, about the inability the trauma forces people to, they are no longer able to really integrate what's happening in their present life. And to kind of move forward. Briefly, just to say that the contributions I think that you have made, Nick, with this study, I think this concept of impossible mourning is fascinating. I think it's fascinating because it really helps us connect how trauma is both about the past and the present. And of course, this idea that it could prevent closure. But I do have a question about that closure aspect. And it really helps us understand how this kind of an impossible mourning actually means there will never be any social cohesion around or after the crisis or the tragedy. The study also very interestingly brings in cultural narratives, which are very important, also more so important now in peace building around local cosmology and local memory, historical memory of communities. Especially this idea of Napolo that you reference, this way that people understand and read tragedy and disaster through past tragedy and disaster. And then lastly, the methodological contribution on autoethnography, which I think is very interesting, and I have some questions about that. But I think it's interesting because it gives researchers and laypersons a way into writing and documenting and making meaning out of collective trauma and putting themselves in a transparent way inside the literature, inside the research, and gives us a multidimensional understanding of suffering. So I think this is a really interesting work that you have contributed. It's been a very costly one in the sense that it's based on huge personal losses and collective grieving. And it has also highlighted several, what I think of as kind of continuums that must be navigated. So I have thought of 3 continuums. One is this continuum between individual and collective healing. First of all, I think when we look at a local context and try to look at a local collective impossible mourning, we have to really kind of challenge Western diagnostic models. You've used a lot of them, or at least have brought them in, but with hauntology and with the kind of cultural cosmology around Napolo, those things kind of really kind of complicate my understanding, at least my understanding of where concepts like PTSD or Western therapeutic models really fit in, and whether or not they are as valuable. I'm not saying they're not valuable for the individual, but they may not be as valuable for the collective, especially in an era when we'll have multiple disasters like this, and people will continually be facing these sorts of disasters. The second trade-off or continuum would be between the psychosocial and the material. There's quite a lot in this study that is about trauma as a psychosocial problem, and about healing and about memory, and hauntology kind of brings that out for us. But then when you hear some of the stories, like Annie's story, there's also quite a lot there where I think about other research in peace building work, for example, about the need to address material needs that people have, that because they cannot move into the future, their whole future that they had even imagined and planned for has been washed away by the cyclone. Not just their families, but their homes, everything is washed away. And that is not just about material, may not even be the right word, but about their ability to everything they had laid out as their future is gone. So that's one of the things I think that's kind of really difficult here, is to think about that kind of the psychological being important, but also helping them really actually build a new future. And then the last is between the local and the global. And you've mentioned international agencies, and the peace building community has now, for example, and I know the humanitarian one as well, is now really grappling with the idea of localization and how do we support the local processes. But obviously when we're able to really excavate local views and collective memories, we really see how vital and important it is to support local processes and agency, and that we're not yet at that stage where we really have been able to get that right, to get that puzzle right. So those are my general comments. My mother did not raise a child who didn't like to talk. But now I just will start and hand over to you. And I think maybe the first thing to do is to ask you a question about Impossible Morning. And you obviously know I buy it. I've bought it. I agree that it's a very powerful, beautiful, like important concept. But now I'm going to put on my critical hat and ask you, is Impossible Morning really a concept that is different? Is there such a thing as impossible morning? Isn't all morning a bit impossible? There's now some research that shows that, closure, for example, is so elusive in all, whether you're, the victim of a car crash or the victim of a genocide, you'll never be able to have complete closure, but you can have recovery or some form of acceptance or healing. So I'd like you to say a little bit more about how this is such a particular concept that you find useful.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll begin with, I think, the last quotation that I gave as I was concluding my lecture. A quotation from Clifford Robson. If you critically examine that quotation, probably the conclusion that you're going to have is, isn't he contradicting himself? Because basically that's what Clifford Robson is saying, that the wounds that people suffer from, they don't heal. Yeah. So if they don't heal, then there is, in a way, there's nothing like impossible morning. Every morning is impossible in one way or the other. I was aware of that, and I was also aware of those contradictions, but I still chose to go along with that concept, probably because I was predicating everything against the history of disasters and the hazards in the country. So people try as much as possible to deal with what they go through on a daily basis. But the sense that you get, and that's the sense that probably I was trying to put across in my lecture, is that while they are almost, because no pain is forgotten forever, while they are trying to forget that, you discover that another one comes. So the cycle, that vicious cycle for me, continues. Hence, probably why I was still more working with the idea of impossibility of mourning, impossibility of finding closure to no pain or a bad experience, because those experiences, it's like they'll come before the end, another one comes. So it's like you start all over again, and then it goes on and on and on. So yes, it's a Western concept, but if you look at that recurring or those series of disastrous events or hazards and what have you, probably there's that element of impossibility in trying to find a semblance, let me use that word, a semblance of closure to what you've just been suffering from. So I don't know, probably I need to tweak it a little bit, or alternatively try and find a better alternative to the whole debate about pain that continues endlessly, probably because, not probably, simply because when one disaster ends, another one immediately joins. And so it becomes a continuous kind of suffering, as it were.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. I mean, I think that's really a very helpful you're distinguishing between a kind of impulsive mourning for something that has happened and never is likely to happen again. But in this case, we're talking about the repetition is not just a repetition of memory, but a likelihood of a repetition of the actual tragedy. There's a lot about hauntology. This kind of leads into which you just said. You talk about hauntology, which if I mean I've read the paper, so I'm fortunate, but part of this language that's challenging is that when you use the term hauntology, can you say a bit more to us now about how the sequence occurs? You've said it now, I think, a little bit with impossible mourning, but how does it really work? I mean, your example that you mentioned about the people getting the news of Cyclone Freddy and then having this first haunting where people imagine people being swept away. That's almost before they actually know that they've actually been swept away. And so it's about sort of the sequence of how does this really work? Can you say more about it?
Probably in the form of triggers. The memory triggers when something is about to happen. In this case, we're talking of the onset of the new season. The onset of the new season, rainy season, it does not necessarily mean that a disaster is coming. But the moment it's rainy season and you have to look at the other dynamics going on, probably not so good housing, not so good social protection measures and so on and so forth. So when rains are coming, I think there is that immediate trigger about, will I be safe? Won't what happened to me yesterday happen to me again today? You understand? So that, of course, I'm using impossible mourning and hauntology probably interchangeably, but it's that haunting memory that I'm trying to play around with, that probably is something that, unless there are some good social protection measures, maybe this is something that has come to stay amongst these communities in so many ways.
That's excellent. That's very helpful. That leads me sort of to the question about responses and the kinds of responses that the state should be engaged in, and kind of how do you actually prevent trauma from recurring. Your study really brings up this concept of using empathy. And I read it and I thought, yes, using this methodology, which brings out individual experiences, and one becomes more, as one will, like when one is reading a story, a narrative, one becomes much more one is able to internalize the experiences that people have undergone, the sort of suffering they are going through and have undergone. And you talk about empathy as a way to do this research. And I actually ask you to think about this a little bit more. How would empathy contribute to us believing these experiences, and then also to policy? So there are some who would argue that being more, not empathetic, but maybe sympathetic, kind of is nurtures caring, but nurtures charity, more or less. Whereas when we're thinking much more about social justice issues and climate justice issues, then the policy response should be rather more systematic in terms of problem solving and prevention, mitigating the disaster. So I both like the empathetic approach, but I'm also challenged by it. Yeah. Are you, does my question come through to you?
It's not that clear.
It's not that clear. So you use empathy in your research. You write about empathy in the study. And you almost want to develop empathy. You want us to relate to Annie and to others through these personal narratives. And it's a different way of writing about disaster. I read a lot of or conflict, or we read a lot of kind of social science that is kind of less individualized, less personal narratives, much more sort of abstract. And you're trying to evoke empathy from the reader. And I was thinking, if I was a policymaker reading this, how would being empathetic really change the policies that I would fight for in order to prevent future disasters and to address trauma? Another way of thinking about it is, what kinds of solutions would you have that international actors or local actors or national actors should be engaged in to prevent this continuous mourning, impossible mourning?
I don't know. Honestly, and there is a reason why I'm saying this. If you're talking about international aid agencies and the kinds of interventions that they make in Africa in general, I think we can have that conversation until probably next week. There is a lot that they do. By the end of the day, without wanting to sound as if we're getting into finger pointing and all that, beyond the empathy, or whether it's sympathy, if we choose to call it that way, how prepared are our leaders to ensure that these issues do not keep on repeating themselves? Probably if we address that, we might, and it's just a might, find a lasting solution to the problems that we're encountering in Africa. That's how I'm looking at this.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know, I could be wrong. The audience can chip in, but that's how I'm looking at the whole issue here.
Thank you very much for a lot of great reflections and summary, Angela. And I think that this last point it's an important question. And I think that I'm one of them that have encouraged you to really go into this, telling the story. And I think that it's important from, different research has different purposes, and your specialty is not like how should Malawi become more resilient. But in order to tell these stories in this powerful way, hopefully people can be engage more in those kind of activities. But now I open up the floor for the audience that are here, and also if there are any questions from Zoom, and Marie will go around with the microphone there. So do you have any questions? We start here in the room. I think it's also for those at Zoom, it's probably better if we use it.
You just, Thank you very much for an amazing and fascinating, sad story, but at the same time, a very important one that needs to be shared and to be narrated in the way that you did. My name is Linley Chuona Carlton. I'm originally from Malawi, but I work at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, and I'm here together with my class that is studying international rural development. So when we got this invitation, we thought it would be a very important one to come and listen, because we're looking at livelihoods and how livelihoods are maintained. So I really liked your presentation, but then I felt that there was another aspect which I was wanting from your presentation, and I'd like to hear your thoughts around this. And it connects a little bit to your comments about the local and the global. The evidence showed that after Cyclone Freddy, the response internationally from the international community was very weak. You gave an example of UNICEF, and then you gave an example of Action Aid. But what was even more interesting was the huge response from the Malawians themselves, both locally and in the diaspora. And also really looking at the 4 cases that you gave about, existential angst and shock and despair and recovery and reparation. And I was thinking there could have been another concept, or you could think about another concept, which is that of Ubuntu or Antu. Yeah. And I'm wondering why, or where is that within your analysis and experience of this lived experience of this particular crisis, the Ubuntu philosophy? Because I really think that the Malawians showed up, and that story also needs to be told, and it needs to be documented. It needs to come out, because always giving so much gratitude to international organizations such as UNICEF and the rest. Yes, it's good. But what about the local responses, the indigenous responses, going back to the words like Napor, and then you have Ubuntu. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for those observations. So I was trying to synthesize something that is 43 pages into 9 pages. And the bit that I haven't covered, I wasn't able to cover, I think Angela is going to agree with me, is the whole discussion of disaster risk reduction and management and what have you. Some of the concerns you are raising, I have addressed them, although I never used the word Ubuntu. I must admit I've never used that concept, but it's something that I can take on board. But when I'm talking about restorative acts, and I have 4 examples that I've brought into the paper. 3 of them are focusing on international aid agencies and what they are doing. But there is one that is zeroing in around, I don't know if you are aware, people like Stanley Onjezani Kenani and the kinds of interventions that they've given to their home country. So I'm talking about the Malawian diaspora stepping in and trying to assist in so many ways. So I try and interrogate that, although I'm doing that against probably that whole narrative about corruption, lack of transparency, in a way trying to say probably the international community has not been as good as it used to be in the past, because most of the times when those resources are channeled to the people through the government, a good number of them, they are diverted for personal use. So it's against that context where I told myself, probably I need to look at what is it that Malawians themselves are doing. So in terms of interventions and the way how those interventions were able to assist in Malawi, you discover that the help or support that came from the diaspora went a long way in trying to assist the affected communities. And it's the same kind of approach that they adopted, in my opinion. They did not pass through the government. They're in the diaspora, they have friends and colleagues in Malawi, so they sent that aid to their colleagues, and then it reached out to the people. But now listening to you, I think probably the concept that I really need to engage with in my study is that of Ubuntu. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a very good question. I think that another country that I've studied a lot is Sudan, and there you have also seen that where the Sudanese people and the Sudanese diaspora has really stepped up in this horrific war that is shattering Sudan at the moment. So it's a very important perspective that we need to pay more attention to. More questions? So we start over here.
Thank you, Nick, for a really powerful talk. I had a question connected to how trauma is being handled at a collective level. And I was curious about the kinds of social institutions that might be emerging around collectively dealing with these disasters, but also the kind of emotional, psychosocial impact.
We could take one more question here. So,
Well, okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Tembo. Really interesting. I happen to be a humanitarian worker and have experienced, for example, the biggest typhoon or / cyclone ever that hit the Philippines, which is still the biggest in the world. And where counting of dead stopped at 30,000. And so it was well beyond that. Obviously, everything that you talk about resonates with me. One thing that I found there in the Philippines, and also I later worked in Ukraine in the war, and I see that females and males deal with grief, disasters, difficulties, whatever you'd like to call it in this context, very, very differently. As where my experience is that women tend to translate it into becoming even more caring. It's their sort of way of dealing with their own grief, is helping others and making it meaningful, the whole sort of process meaningful, as where men tend to be much more, internalize it much more, just sort of closing up and basically not being able to deal with it. And sometimes actually going into violent behavior, overconsumption of alcohol, those kind of things. And not turning to religion, for example, which I find that I have seen. My experience is that women, girls, young girls, tend to do much more than men. So what is your experience after your case studies? I'd really like to hear your perspective. Thank you.
Can I begin with that?
Sure.
And then I'll get back to, those experiences, I think they cut across cultures and societies. Malawi is not different in terms of handling pressure, trauma, and what have you. Men, not all of them, of course, but choose to handle their pains by drowning in beer, as opposed to women. And that's why, even when we're talking about help, whether we're talking about international aid agencies or people living in the diaspora, if you read literature around that, you discover that most of the times that help goes to the woman, I think the understanding is she's more caring. She will be in a position to at least reach out to so many people, as opposed to men who it is feared that probably they might use that money to go and drink and forget about their problems, which is an individual kind of thing, because by the end of the day, it will just be you trying to process your pain, and not your family or community members. So those experiences, I would say, they cut across societies, as it were. How is trauma handled at, you said, at family or collective levels? Unless I don't know of any. Usually people have been more like they've come together more and talk about God more. So if we're talking about social institutions, probably we'll be referring to churches. We'll be referring to traditional leaders. Trying to talk to the affected communities and the people in general, and the people being more religious, drawing closer to God. Beyond that, I don't think there are any known social institutions that have been created for Cyclone Freddy in trying to deal with these issues. And unless probably I've never come across that kind of literature before. But yes, we meet and talk about these issues. I don't want to call it an association, so I'm just going to say psychologists have also been in the forefront trying to reach out to people who are going through some stuff. So counseling services are there 24/7. Within the University of Malawi, a committee was put in place. Again, the aim was to try and speak to the university community in case you're going through some issues, whether they're related to Cyclone Freddy or not. I think there are services that will be available for you. You can come and talk to us. But the downside with those kinds of institutions that have been put in place is that people tend to have this idea of, so everybody is going to know that I'm going to meet Angela and she's going to counsel me. So by the end of the day, they tend to shun those things and choose probably to find their own ways of trying to process or deal with the pain around them. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much. This is a very nice mic, by the way. Thank you so much for a really evocative and thought-provoking lecture and the discussion. You mentioned the audacity of hope, and I would really like to ask you, so what gives people hope in such situation, if anything? And I would also like to hear more about the diaspora engagement. And again, you mentioned traumatization and secondary traumatization. Is that also the case for diaspora groups who engage with events like this? Thank you.
So what is it that gives people hope in the midst of adversity? Of course, when I was using the audacity of hope, I was citing the book that probably you're already aware of. Is it by Barack Obama, if not Michelle Obama? I think Barack Obama. Malawi is a very religious country. When crises happen, I think this provides a platform for people to draw to God closer, even more than how they used to be in the past. But more importantly, probably people know that if they are going to depend on external help, things are not going to work for them. So there will always be those kinds of internal support systems that people are going to put together so as to support each other. Okay, that's what I would say for now, that usually there's those communal support systems that are put together so that people at least can imagine the pain, can process the pain together, and then they can encourage each other together as they try and deal with what they are going through. The second question was about the diaspora in terms of
Secondary trauma.
Secondary traumatization.
Secondary traumatization from the diaspora.
No, from the. No, so you mentioned in the beginning that you also experienced like a secondary traumatization.
Yes.
So I'm wondering the diaspora witnessing from a distance, close family members being in such situations, etc.
Now that I've not thought about in terms of do they also get traumatized secondarily, although it's not something that we can rule out. Because as I said, if you look at Cyclone Freddy and what it did to the country, everybody was affected either directly or indirectly. The issue of frantic phone calls that I was talking about, you may think this was just in relation to me, but believe you me, everybody was in that mode of trying to find out who is safe and who is not safe. We are constantly circulating, information on social media, on Facebook, trying to find out, try to check on who is doing what is happening to them, and so on and so forth. So even in the diaspora, most of the information, by the way, about what was happening, much of it was also coming from our colleagues in the diaspora. That's a sign that they were constantly checking on what was happening in Malawi, and they were able to inform us about what else we need to do, and so on and so forth. So probably in that context, they are also traumatized. That's what I would say.
Okay, we have time for one brief more question.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My question was kind of building on your reflection of trauma. Emotions that I would associate with trauma are also shame and guilt. And I was wondering if you could perhaps reflect on if that has come up in your experience with the tragedy, or in researching that tragedy, either on a societal level with regards to figures in power, or perhaps more interpersonal. If you could reflect on that a bit, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Issues of guilt?
Shame and guilt.
Shame and guilt, yes, plenty of them. Usually when something happens, I think it's normal for people to begin to say, maybe I should have done better. Only if I'd done this, maybe my friend, this wouldn't have happened to my friend. And there is a way in which that not only eats this other person up, but they feel guilty in so many ways. If you allow me to use the example of what happened to these 17 extended family relations. So these are people that I've never met, by the way. And there are people that my wife, because they're related to my wife, has never met as well. So it's a sister and children and relations that are related to my wife's cousin. Now, this is a friend, my in-law, who is living in Edinburgh, had been in Malawi a few months before, but as usual, he was so busy, he came to visit us, but he never went to visit them. And then he flew back to Edinburgh. When this happened, he was literally pinching himself, feeling so guilty that probably he could have acted in a better way. Whether or not he was in a position, he was going to be in a position to do that, that is probably not what we are talking about here. But that feeling of guilt that probably if I was available, probably if I had done things in this way, things would have gotten to this state. Those things are always there. That's what I would say. Do I deal with them in my study? No, I don't. That is something that I'm willing to engage with. I just need to tease out those nuances and to see how the whole idea of guilt comes into the picture.
Thank you very much for all great questions. And the one thing that I take with me that I feel almost as the most captivating of it all is this seasonal traumatization that the climate change brings about. So if you are a victim of a war, at least there might be hope that the war will not come again. But if you're a victim of climate crisis and all the signals talk so that it seems like it will happen again, then there's a new type of traumatization. And to not make Angela disappointed, that also started me to think about Bob Dylan quote, and he says in his songs Masters of War, you throw the worst fear that can ever be heard, fear to bring children into the world. And I think that both climate change and the war that are happening are sort of doing that, and might be part of the reason why we see so very sharply decreasing birth rate all over the world. But to end a bit more positively, those very declining birth rate might also help us in order to overcome the climate crisis in the end. But now I'll leave the floor to you, Eleanor.
Thank you very much, colleagues, both here in the room and online. I've been looking over Anna's shoulder, and it's very heartening to see how many people have joined us virtually, which is the first time for this in the Claude Ake lecture. I'm going to say a few words just to draw the lecture to a close. As the chair highlighted in the introduction, Professor Nick Tembo is the 19th visiting Claude Ake chair. At the Nordic Africa Institute, we very much appreciate this cross-institutional collaboration with the Department of Peace and Conflict Research, and we hope it will continue long into the future. Professor Tembo, listening this afternoon to your lecture on excavating memories of Cyclone Freddy in Malawi, I'm reminded how intellectually stimulating it is for us to have professorial scholars from institutions across the African continent visiting us here in Uppsala, enriching our scholarly endeavour and bringing nuanced perspectives from different disciplines and geographies on the continent. I've appreciated the conceptual lens you have brought to issues of disaster and trauma in terms of drawing an understanding from the French philosopher Derrida, amongst others, appropriately, given his intellectual challenge to ideas of Western culture and influence on literary studies, as well as many other disciplines. In your lecture, you've spoken and written movingly of how Cyclone Freddy has impacted you and your family, 18 members of your family. For this, I'm truly sorry for your loss. While it has been devastating for you, I'm also thankful for how you have constructively addressed this experience to ask questions of how personal and collective experiences of trauma play out over time, place, and generation. In this endeavour, methodologically, you've also creatively used your positionality in the form of autoethnography to seek better understanding of individual and collective experiences within the human condition. Bring an important reminder to us of how conditions of the past infiltrate and influence the present in ways that are not fully recognised or acknowledged, but coalesce within systematic vulnerabilities confronting societies across the continent. As we have discussed, this is timely. Peoples on the continent experiencing natural disasters, staring the climate crisis in the face, and witnessing the human face of conflict in so many places, as Johan has reminded us for Sudan, for example. But also people who are picking up the pieces and reminding us that life goes on. And we've had many questions from the audience around this issue of collective endeavour and hope, and how people are coming together. For Cyclone Freddy, for example, against the backdrop of devastation and many losses, one reads of lives being rebuilt, of people coming together, the fruit of new harvests, the importance of faith, particularly, and of the building of new flood defences. I think you captured this briefly in your talk. I realise you didn't have the chance to do justice to it in the idea of resilient agency, if I'm understanding correctly. Bringing as you have perspectives and methods from literature, philosophy, psychology, and anthropology, your scholarship reminds us of the importance of witnessing and remembrance, and to, in many contexts outside Malawi, the promotion of reconciliation and the building of peace. Ultimately, it reminds us the continual need for reflection, learning, and inspiration. And for this, we're truly grateful that you have really enabled us to have this thought-provoking discussion today. On that note, I would like to say very thank you, and perhaps we could raise our hands too. Thank you very much. So much for joining us today, and it was very nice to have colleagues from SLU coming. I'm really pleased that you joined us. On that note, Johan and I, on behalf of our departments, would like to invite you all to a reception and say thank you very much, and I hope you'll be here next year.